Namaste, friends. Welcome to the third episode of this series on the Bhagavad Gita. Thank you for tuning in. So, in the first episode of the series, we started with the very first verse of the Gita, the first chapter where Dhritarashtra, the blind king, is asking his attendant Sanjaya what is happening, what happened in the battlefield of Kurukshetra. Last week, we took a slight detour, and I wanted to dedicate the day and the class to Swami Kriyananda, my own spiritual teacher. So we looked at a verse from the second chapter, and in this chapter, I'm going to go back, in this episode, I'm going to go back to the first chapter again. As I was mentioning last week too, I'm realizing that there is a lot of value in going along with the flow of the Gita and in sequence. So I'll try my best, unless I don't, to keep with the sequence of the chapters and the verses as Vyasa presents them in the Bhagavad Gita. But I'm not going to go through each and every verse because I want to make this course useful and also for us to get through concepts. So I will be talking about all the concepts mentioned in the chapters, but I'm not necessarily going to deal with every single verse of the Gita. And the verse I picked for today is the 10th verse of the first chapter. I'll first present the verse, and then I'll give you the translation, and we will talk briefly about what that verse means and its practical application for us in our own life. The verse goes like this: Aparyaptam tadasmakam balam Bhishma bhirakshitam Paryaptam tu idam etesham balam Bhima bhirakshitam. Now, in this 10th verse, Sanjaya is narrating to Dhritarashtra what is happening on the battleground. And at this point in the story, he is describing a conversation that is happening between Duryodhana, the chief, the first brother on the Kaurava side, and Dronacharya, the guru or the teacher of both the Pandavas and the Kauravas, who is presently fighting the battle on the Kaurava side. And this conversation is between the two of them, and Sanjaya is narrating it to Dhritarashtra. We have not yet entered the part where Krishna and Arjuna are speaking. We are going to get there very soon. Now, if you have seen any of these episodes or heard me speak about this topic, you already know by now that all the characters in the story of the Mahabharata are in fact symbols. They represent aspects of our own consciousness, and this entire battle is, after all, that battle between the positive and the negative forces within ourselves that are fighting for control over our consciousness. The Pandavas representing the positive side and the Kauravas representing the negative side. And there are two characters that we are seeing in this particular verse, Duryodhana and Dronacharya. What do they represent? Duryodhana, Yogananda, my guru, in his commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, he called him King Material Desire. And that's how he refers to Duryodhana throughout his commentaries. Duryodhana represents, he's a symbol for all those material desires, all those ways in which we seek fulfillment on the material plane, we seek fulfillment through the senses. That's really what Duryodhana represents. And if you know anything about the story, he is that primary force because of whom the war has to happen. There are so many points in the story where he is unwilling to compromise even a tiny bit for the sake of the Pandava brothers. The Pandavas, on the other hand, throughout the story are constantly trying to make compromise, trying to avoid the war from happening. Now, the other character is Dronacharya. Dronacharya, as I mentioned, is the teacher to both Pandavas and the Kauravas. What he represents is the power of habit patterns from the past. We use the Sanskrit word samskaras to denote that. The samskaras are essentially the habit patterns that we bring from our own past, and they represent the power of the subconscious mind. That is why Drona has to be that teacher who trains not only the Kauravas but the Pandavas too. Again, if you're not familiar with this, the Pandavas and the Kauravas are cousins. They grew up together in the palace of Hastinapura. So during their childhood, as they were growing up, both these cousins, both these sets of brothers were trained by this one teacher, Dronacharya, and he is a great teacher in archery, warfare, and everything that they needed to learn. But the interesting fact, however, is that during the time of battle, he does have to side with the throne of Hastinapura, so he does end up fighting with the Kaurava brothers. And it's not an accident. He is a good guy, but that power of subconscious habit finally has to be overcome, because for us to merge into superconscious, we have to break all those things that bind us to the past. So in that sense, he is somebody who is ultimately going to be with the Kauravas and fighting the battle from their side. Now, I think I did not give the literal translation of the verse, so I'll give that first before moving forward. The verse simply translates like this: unlimited, this is Duryodhana again speaking to Dronacharya, unlimited is the strength of our army that is being protected by Bhishma, and limited is the strength of the Pandava army that is being protected by Bhima. Now, it's a very, very simple verse. I'll also briefly mention the two other characters that these two are speaking about, and they are Bhishma and Bhima. Bhishma is the grandfather of both the Pandava and the Kaurava brothers. He's not technically the grandfather because he does not have children of his own. The Pandavas and Kauravas are grandchildren of his brother, but for all practical purposes, he plays the role of grandfather. And what Bhishma represents is that identification with ego consciousness, that identification with limited self, our own body, mind, which we get confused and think we are, rather than the true soul nature, our true identity in God. So Bhishma represents that fundamental delusion of ego consciousness. And Bhima, the Pandava brother, he is the second Pandava brother. There are 5 Pandava brothers. Perhaps in the next episode, we will spend some time talking about the Pandava brothers when we visit the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna. The 5 Pandava brothers are symbols for the 5 lower chakras in the astral spine in our own yogic anatomy. And Bhima represents the 4th chakra, the heart chakra, Anahata. And he's a symbol for that uplifted energy of the heart center. He represents devotion. He represents the heart energy uplifted toward the divine. And he also represents the wind element, which is what is the symbolic of the heart chakra. He represents prana. And in that sense, the uplifted aspect of that energy is pranayama, is complete control over the flows of energy in one's body and one's energetic self. So that's really what Bhima represents. And Duryodhana is telling Dronacharya, our army is protected by Bhishma and the Pandava army is protected by Bhima. And then he says, our strength is unlimited and their strength is limited. This is one of my favorite verses in the Gita because this idea is very fascinating. It's fascinating for one important reason, which is that right before we enter the Bhagavad Gita, as Vyasa describes the story of the Mahabharata, he gives us a lot of specific details of this war of Kurukshetra. And he describes the strength of the 2 armies. And I can tell you, it is not unlimited. In fact, Vyasa gives exact counts. There is this unit for counting battle power in those days. It's called Akshauhini. That's how in the Mahabharata the strength of the armies is described. 1 Akshauhini is thousands of elephants and chariots and foot soldiers and horses and just a battle unit. But it's huge. It's a really, really large battle unit. And Vyasa, before the battle begins, tells, the Kauravas have 11 Akshauhinis and the Pandavas have 7. Which means the Kauravas have 50% more strength than the Pandava brothers. And because this is a war happening on a very large scale, everybody in the entire Indian subcontinent is forced to take sides. They either have to side with the Pandavas or the Kaurava brothers. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism that is represented here, but also I have to say, like Yogananda ji explained to us, Vyasa woven a lot of symbolism in the story in order to give us these spiritual teachings. But this war is not mythical. The war of Kurukshetra actually did happen, and there were actually 2 clans of cousins fighting for control of the kingdom. Let me just say that because I talk a lot about the symbolism, and that's really what we are focusing in this series. But that does not mean that this whole war is mythological. In the Indian scriptures, we call the Mahabharata and Ramayana itihasas, which means we consider them historical. So in that sense, we are talking about real events that transpired in history at some point. And Krishna was a real being. He was an incarnation of the divine who did walk this earth and who did come to teach us these teachings. So Vyasa is giving us all these details, and he talks about how all these rulers, all these tiny kingdoms around Hastinapura and Indraprastha, all of them side either with the Pandava or the Kaurava brothers. And each one of them brings their own Akshahinis, their own battle forces to join the battle. And he talks about how much battle strength each ruler brings to each side and all of that. Those details are not obviously relevant to us right now. But the point is, it is not unlimited. He does give us exact numbers. Then why does Vyasa say in this verse, why does Duryodhana rather say that the Kaurava army is unlimited? Now, this idea makes a lot more sense if we understand the spiritual principle that Vyasa is presenting to us, that is being given to us through this verse in the Gita, which is simply this, that delusion, the material plane, is complex. Its ways are unlimited. It's infinite in its complexity. Whereas the path to divine, the spiritual path, is simple. It is uncomplicated. That's the message of this verse of the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, Vyasa uses the word aparyaptam, which literally means unlimited, or even more specifically, not measurable. Now, that is almost contradicting himself, because he just literally did measure all the armies and give us the numbers. What I mean by the plane of delusion being complex and unlimited is that when energy is drawn out of our center, when that energy, that prana coming into that spine, into our subtle spine, is drawn out through the senses, and we are drawn to engage in that world, there are infinite number of ways in which that energy can be drawn. Think of any aspect of life. I was even thinking about this today morning, and I was thinking about even spirituality. On this material plane, on the physical plane, when we practice spirituality, we are all tuning into one eternal truth. There are no two gods. I mean, there are deities and representations and aspects of God that we worship in various forms. But the Vedas and the Indian scriptures tell us that God is one, and so do every other scripture in every other religion. And yet, just look around. How many languages, how many traditions, how many rituals, how many different ways in which we worship that divine. It almost creates so much confusion and oftentimes even tension between our own brothers, because we all think that this is the right way to do it. Now, the Christians want to read the Bible, the Muslims want to read the Quran, and then there's the Sufis, there's the Sikhs, there are Hindus, and even within Hinduism, there's so many different sects, so many different ways of practicing rituals, so many different languages. And yet, all the mystics, all the saints, all realized beings are telling us that God is one. Every enlightened master, from the Buddha to Jesus to Shankaracharya to Yogananda to Ramakrishna, all of them talk about God as being one, as being consciousness, as being love, as being pure light. And if there is just this one God, one absolute truth that we are seeking, why is it that all these forms are so complex? Why can't we just come together and agree on one way to worship? It is absolutely impossible, because that is the way of delusion. That is the way of this material reality. That is the way of the physical plane, that once it is drawn to this gross level, then it is really impossible to unify, because the ways of delusion are complex. They're unlimited and impossible to measure. There are so many ways in which we can present things and interact with this world. I was even thinking about how, you can look around and see every single person around you, perhaps not right now because most of us are alone in our homes, but in general, think of all the people in your own life, all your friends, everybody in your family, everybody who you're in touch with, and just think about how unique everybody's physical features are, how we all look so different, and even far beyond just the physical features, how complex we are inside, but also how uniquely different we are from each other. How our karma, what we bring into this world, is simply our own. That when we are in this delusion, somehow there's infinite variations to how we can get confused. Yogananda ji's first book that he ever wrote is titled The Science of Religion. And the primary idea that he wanted to present in this book, and which is the foundation, which was his essential teaching that he brought to the West and brought all these techniques to us, it was this primary principle that all of us, all conscious beings, not just humans, every being in creation is just seeking two things: to find happiness and to avoid suffering. And yet, we are all confused in all these different ways, because when we are drawn into delusion, when we are under the rulership of Duryodhana, and when we are controlled by the Kaurava brothers on this physical plane, our energy is drawn out in unlimited ways, and we all seek that happiness, we all seek to avoid suffering in such unique individual ways. I think I will not have suffering if I have a lot of money. Somebody else thinks they will find happiness in their next relationship. Somebody else wants the next car. Somebody else wants to climb Mount Everest. Somebody else wants to travel the world, and somebody wants to help the poor. Somebody wants to take a gun and shoot people. And we are so confused in where we seek this happiness, and yet we are all seeking that one truth. And it might also, it might even seem a little bit glib to say that the spiritual path is simple, and yet that is the truth. In fact, one of the quotations from the autobiography of a yogi is Yogananda ji telling us, God is simple, everything else is complex. And if I have this right, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm only slightly paraphrasing. I think he says, we cannot find absolute values in the relative world of nature. That is to say, this relative world of nature, he doesn't mean the beautiful natural world, he just means the physical plane, the material plane of gross reality. We cannot find the absolute here on this plane at all, because this is the plane of the Kauravas. This is the plane of energy being drawn out from the spine and flowing into that physical reality, being drawn out through the senses, because the material plane is simply an abstraction that we perceive through the five senses. And on this plane, life is complex, that the absolute cannot really be understood clearly or even perceived directly. And yet, the spiritual path is simple. God is simple. What that means is, it doesn't mean that the spiritual path is easy. I also have to say that, because the spiritual path is simple in the sense that there are only 5 Pandava brothers. There's only one pathway to raise that Kundalini energy. There's only one pathway to draw all that energy from the senses back into the spine. I don't mean only one technique or one way of meditating or one way of living life. What I mean is only one direction for the energy to flow, which is inside and up. And that's what makes a spiritual path simple. And what does it look like? It simply is the opening of the heart, focusing of all our energies, and offering one pointedly into the divine light. That's the definition of the spiritual path. But there is no way to measure or define delusion, because the desires are endless. So in this verse, Vyasa is presenting that idea to us through the words of Duryodhana, that his army, the strength that the material plane has, is unlimited. In fact, that's the idea that gives Duryodhana this mistaken impression that in fact he is going to win the war. There is this beautiful story of both Arjuna and Duryodhana meeting Krishna, and Duryodhana wins the entire army of Krishna, which is the biggest army of all the sub-rulers brought into this battle of Kurukshetra, whereas Arjuna does not get any of that. All he gets is the guidance and the support of Krishna, who will be standing by his side during the war and who will not even lift a weapon. And yet, the Pandavas are about to win the battle at the end of the battle of Kurukshetra, and Duryodhana all this while is mistaken. He thinks he can win the battle because, after all, his strength is unlimited. So when we work with ourselves, we do not want to project that complexity of the human mind, of the material plane, onto God. No matter what problems we are facing in our life, the solutions are simple. They are not always easy, because they might take an extraordinary amount of willpower or energy depending upon the complexity of the situation you're dealing with. I'll end with this one quotation by Lahiri Mahasaya, who is the source of all these interpretations of Gita that I'm sharing with you now. He used to say, no matter what problem you face in your life, no matter what situations you're caught up in, the advice that he gave to his disciples was, do more Kriya, or practice your meditation. It doesn't matter even if you do not know the Kriya Yoga technique or if that's not what you practice, but that advice is simply that: go inside, draw your energy back from the senses, offer it up to the divine. No matter what problem it is that you're facing in your life, the spiritual path, the techniques we use are very, very simple, because there is only one way, which is inside and upward into that divine light. The path of delusion, on the other hand, is immeasurable. It's complicated and unlimited, and there's no end to the ways in which we can get caught in that. So with that, I think we will end the commentary on this verse. Next week, I hope to start with the conversation between Arjuna and Krishna, and we will explore a little bit more of the symbolism before diving into the philosophy that Krishna is going to share with Arjuna. So until then, God bless you all.